Okay, so let's get started. Apologies for starting a bit late, but we were told to start late because the previous session started late. So let's hope we don't have too much of this as the day goes along. My name is Bernard Hoekman. I'm a professor and a director at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies here at the European University Institute. You all know what the topic is of today, which is the governance of transatlantic economic relations, with a particular focus on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, but not necessarily confined to that, right? So we can, it's a broader topic, although I think a lot of the interest probably in the room will focus on TTIP and what TTIP is all about or not is all about and what the effects are of TTIP. Just to give a little bit of context, and I apologize for this particular slide, which is very small, but you know, why is this of interest? And by the way, this data I'm going to present comes from something called Global Stat, which is a project that is being run at the Robert Schuman Center, which is a huge collection of data on all kinds of indicators you could imagine. So for those of you who are interested in indicators on not just governance, but also all kinds of economic and non-economic variables, have a look at this site. So the context with respect to the EU and the US is, you know, this is a very big and very dynamic trade and investment relationship. And the top lines here show you the amount of foreign direct investment that has actually gone into the EU from the US and the amount that has gone into the US from the EU. And these are very big numbers. We're talking, you know, $1.6+ trillion in terms of investment going across the Atlantic. The lower lines look a little bit smaller, but they're also quite big, and they reflect the amount of trade that actually goes on between the US and the EU. And one of the striking features about the trade pattern between the US and the EU is that it is very heavily oriented towards services, much more in a relative sense than what we see the EU trading with other countries or that we see the US trading with other countries. And these two things are related. So to a significant extent, we see a larger share of services being traded because there is so much more foreign direct investment crossing the Atlantic, because a lot of these services require investment. And I'm sure we'll be talking about investment a fair bit this morning, because that, of course, has been one of the flashpoints in terms of the public debate about the implications of a TTIP, which has to do with the rights that investors have to actually sue governments. But I think the one takeaway to keep in mind, and I think we'll come back to this also because we have a representative from a services company who will speak about services from the company perspective, but also more generally, services is a large part of the equation. And that is also one reason why I think the debate in Europe, in particular, I think less so in the United States, has been fraught in terms of civil society, because when you talk about services, you very quickly talk about regulation, right? And services, of course, account for very large shares of our economies. 70 to 80% of all employment and economic activity is in services, and services cover things like health, education, audiovisual, things that are politically sensitive, and that certainly have been very prominent in the people who oppose a transatlantic trade and investment treaty. So those are some of the things we're going to be talking about in this panel. And just to give you again another slide with respect to the support that exists and kind of the political dimension of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, this map shows you which countries are actually in favor or not in favor of an agreement with the United States. And the darker the color, the more people are in favor of an agreement with the United States. And what you can see from this map is that it kind of breaks down along different dimensions. On the one hand, we have an east-west divide. So some of the newly acceded members of the European Union tend to be more in favor than some of the incumbent members, if I can call them that. But what you can also see is that some of the smaller countries, the more open countries, the countries that really rely a lot on trade, are not surprisingly much more in favor than some of the other larger countries. So that would include Ireland, the Netherlands, my country, Denmark. So we have this heterogeneity within the European Union with respect to support. And I think the one country that comes out, I think, as the one that is most vocally and I think visibly opposed to a TTIP is France. And just for those of you who have seen the papers recently with respect to the stance of the French government to TTIP, I'll just cite the Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, basically saying TTIP will not succeed if it does not guarantee that the standards we have in France for our citizens' health and environment will be maintained, right? So very clear view there and a very clear concern that TTIP might erode the ability of governments to regulate. The French trade minister has also been, I think, quite revealing in statements with respect to TTIP. Actually, when asked, is there a chance, what are the chances for TTIP to succeed? He replied that the risk of reaching any accord is fading, right? So it's not the prospects, it's the risks. So it's very much this notion of there is a risk here to worry about. So I think one of the things we'll do in the panel in discussing these types of issues is one, what are the prospects? But more importantly, what really are the economic issues? I mean, so what is at stake? What matters in this? One dimension of this has nothing really to do with the EU and the US relationship at all. It's more focused on the rest of the world, right? Because one of the objectives that underpin the effort to negotiate a TTIP is actually to see whether the US and the EU can agree on a whole set of new areas for the multilateral trading system, which, as I'm sure you all know, has not been doing particularly well in recent years, with the Doha round essentially being put to rest last year. So there are a large number of new issues that need to really be addressed at the global level and where we still don't have much in the way of action. So I think one of the ways to think about TTIP is this is a way for the US and the EU to actually agree on what to do on new issues, which might then be brought to the WTO. So we have three excellent speakers, and we're basically going to jump around a little bit in terms of who presents first. So Giorgia Giovanetti, who is a professor at the University of Florence in the Department of Economics, but also a professor here at the European University Institute with the Robert Schuman Center, is going to kick off. Then we're going to have Deirdre Curtin, who is a professor in law in the law department of the European University Institute here, but is also has an appointment at the Robert Schuman Center. So we have a little bit of a bias here towards Schuman, but given that we organized it, we felt we could do that. And then last but not least, our final speaker is going to be Elena Bryan, who used to be with the US government, working for the United States Trade Representative in a variety of functions, both in Washington, but more recently in Brussels, was very much involved in these negotiations, but has, in the last year, left to join UPS. So Elena will also be able to provide a private sector's perspective, which I think is very important to get a sense of, what are firms looking for, what are the issues from the perspective of a company like UPS, which is of course a services company. So in that sense, I think is very representative of the broader relationship. So Giorgia, over to you.
Thanks, Bernard. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. Let me see, here we are. I'm going to present some slides, and I'm going to rush a little through the slides, but then we can go back, because I want to sort of just give a general framework of the deal. And the outline is basically the following. I will just say something about the deal in terms of size and main characteristics. Bernard showed some data, so I will jump on those data, but I will show you some more. Then I will try to find a way of reading the different chapters with the potential sticking point and the controversies, and try to summarize the state of the art after 13 rounds and the leaks. And I think the leaks that just happened at the beginning of the week will be something that will affect the discussion to a certain extent. I will briefly show you a table on the estimated impact of TTIP on US and EU, but what I will point out is the heterogeneity, and I think the heterogeneity is a very, very important aspect to take account, not only in terms of different EU countries, but also in terms of different US states, and this is something that people usually don't look at, different production and export specialization, different firm size. There is a debate about the role of small firms and large firms, whether that's different, whether that matters or not. Different role and positioning in global value chain, different capacity to react to shocks. Of course, I cannot do all of these in 15 minutes, but I will try to give you some hints and just throw some argument for topics for discussion and things like that, and I will try to sum up, if possible. Bernard already said that it's really large, the size of transatlantic economy. Basically, it's about 34% of world GDP and 70% of world FDI, which is Bernard was also showing. So the FDI is a very, very important issue. Now, if you look at the trade in goods and services, the first is goods, the last is service, and in the middle, you have some major products in the goods exchange between the US and EU. The red is import, EU import, the green is EU export. So basically, what happened is that it's large, and not only that, but in terms of goods, Europe has a very large surplus, which is different in different productive sectors. In terms of services, contrary to what people would think, the EU has a surplus, even though it's much smaller than for goods. So there is a surplus also in terms of services. However, trade is really very, very small if you compare it to the sales of US affiliates in EU, and the same in the other way around. This graph, you have the sales of US affiliates in Europe and US export to Europe. And basically, it's 5 times as much. So it's really, really a lot more. This is the same for the EU affiliates in the sale of EU affiliates in Europe versus US imports. I think these data make you really think what kind of trade, what kind of relationship there is between Europe and the United States. Now, of course, people are very interested about the employment. So I just look at some data on foreign affiliates employees. Basically, it's 4 million people in Europe and 4 million people in the United States. So it's very even, but there is a very large heterogeneity in the number of employees in different countries, and also the balance between the plus and the minus is very different. I'm not going to go into detail. In any case, if anyone is interested in the details, the slides are available, so you can always get them. What I said, that investment is much more than trade, is true for all the areas in terms of US, but it's particularly true for the transatlantic area. In this graph, you have the transatlantic, but also you have the trade and investment to the Asia-Pacific, you have the NAFTA, you have the Latin America. So basically it gives you an idea. If you see the one, the sort of light one are the trade, and the dark one are the foreign direct investment, and the area are defined by the color. The blue is the transatlantic, is incredibly much more. There is a difference in all of them, but for transatlantic, really, foreign direct investment dominates. It's just a different way to present what Bernard was saying at the beginning. Now, the other aspect that we have been looking at, or we can look at, is obviously tariffs. Tariffs are low. They are lower in the United States with respect to Europe, but basically they are low. However, in some of the sectors, the tariffs are higher. And of course, when we speak about TTIP, the idea is one of the scenarios is to have zero tariffs, and I think that's probably the easiest of the chapter to reach, is to have to lower the tariffs or to have zero tariffs. Now, one thing which is important, however, is that the tariff peaks are different, and while Europe has higher tariff with respect to the United States, if you look at the peaks in some products, the United States have higher. Now, of course, this is at the level of product, so it can be the eggs or the chicken or this kind of thing, so it's very, very detailed. At a very, it may not be much in terms of amount of trade and numbers or import and export, but it's important to see that this is the kind of things we are. So basically, if I want to summarize the data, what you can say is that EU and US account for about 40% of total trade. To give you an idea, this is more than $1.5 billion a day. So it's quite a lot. And this trade trigger a lot of employment on both sides of the Atlantics. The sales of the US affiliates in EU are 3 times as much the US-EU trade, and vice versa. EU is better off at the moment. We have a surplus in goods, a small surplus in services, and of course, if you look at the bilateral sector balances, the picture is much more complicated, but still, usually, the EU has a surplus. Now, the tariffs are low, But here, and this is something important, the TTIP contribution is meant to be much more on regulatory convergence rather than on tariffs. And because the regulatory convergence means that the costs to adjust to the standard are very high. So basically, my message of this first part is the size justifies the attention. The intra-trade of affiliates is very relevant, and I think it should be studied much more. And the regulatory convergence can substantially lower the cost. And this is very crucial, especially for small, medium enterprises. Keep in mind this because I think Europe is characterized by at least some countries in Europe, I'm Italian, so this may bias my view, are characterized by a very large size of small, medium enterprises. What is the state of the art? 13 rounds so far, and some chapters have been excluded. These are the round. You find not only the round, but you find the minutes of what has happened in each individual round in the web page of the Commission. So just if you want to know exactly what has happened, you can just go into the web page in the Commission and find the minutes of the meetings. Now, this is something which I think is interesting, and I got it from Bertelsmann, which is a study that was done in 2013, and the idea was that you can rank along two different dimensions the chapters under discussion. The two dimensions are the degree of importance and the degree of difficulties. So basically, the ones which are really under the lens are the ones which are up on the right, which are the ones which are important and difficult. And these are the really potential sticking point because they are the ones which are under discussion. Now, what I try to do, though I wish I had more time to do it, is I try to do the same exercise after 13 rounds. So what I try, the two dimensions that I try to look at are using the difficulty that Bertelsmann has given, but the chapters have evolved, some have changed, also to put on which chapter there was progress, in which chapter there was limited progress, and no progress or substantial progress. And so if you see, there has been progress achieved in most of the issues, independently on how difficult they were. So those are the things on which there is a common paper between the US and you at the moment, are the one between progress and substantial progress. And the difficulty, you see, for instance, trade is down because it was considered the easiest one, so this is just from 2.5 onwards. And so basically my message is the progress has been achieved, but there are still many issues to be dealt with, and of course, especially on those, on the open question, the leaks do not help. Some of the chapters are out, like the audiovisual services, the data protection, some of the things have gone out of the deal. Now, of course, if you want to look at the impact, you have a lot of studies. This is just a summary table with some of the early study, like the CPR, the Ecorist, but some of the new study, like Capalbo. Basically, the idea is that if you want to look at the effect on the EU GDP and on the US GDP, is not very strong. Depending on the type of assumptions, which are the one in the bottom part of the table, you can find higher impact on EU and US. And of course, this table doesn't account at all for the impact on outsider, which is a topic that I'm not going to deal with during this talk, but I think is a very, very important topic, the impact on outsiders. Now, of course, you have a lot of country studies. I reported some, which I'm not going to, which basically gives you the idea of the heterogeneity. You can summarize this in a table. This is just from a paper where you have an index that accounts for specialization and sustainability of tariff. Now, one thing that you can notice is that actually the countries which, according to the model, are going to gain more are not the ones which were more in favor of the TTIP that Bernard was showing before. For instance, look at Germany or UK. So UK was very low in Bernard map of Europe, and is very dark here, which means that they're going to be better off. So that's interesting that people are not really affected by the results that this study have. This is just the index, how it's calculated, and it's in numbers for different European countries. Now, however, the benefits of the TTIP are very different also in different US states. For instance, this is if you have an ambitious TTIP, meaning by ambitious the fact that not only you lower tariff, but you agree on a lot of regulation and other chapters. These are the increase in export Now, of course, the percentage increase in export can be due to the fact that you have very low export to Europe to start with, which is the case, for instance, of Utah, but as you can see, is more on the East Coast than it is on the West Coast. Now, of course, I think that what is very important is to try and explain these differences. How do you do that? Well, I think what you should take into account when you look at this impact is the different specialization in production and export in different EU countries and US states. Why? Mainly because if you are specialized in different goods or services, these will result in different interest in different chapters and will result in different gains and losses according to the agreement that you reach. Of course, you can have a specialization in services like the US, or agriculture like France, or manufacturing like Italy or Germany, and this will affect your negotiation interest and the results on your economy. Of course, within the manufacturing, within the services, you can have different specialization. And again, whether you reach an agreement on the automotive or not will favor some countries and some people within those countries and not some others. So this is kind of things which you will have to account. Another important thing is the different destination market. How many of the European countries export to which states in the United States and vice versa? What I think is more important, however, is the capacity of firms to enter into global value chain and the different positioning along the global value chain. I have no time to go into everything, but just to show you, for instance, these are just examples of heterogeneity. The US state export of goods to Europe, you see the East Coast. There is a role for trade cost, which may be important. The East Coast is closer to Europe, and therefore the export of goods are more concentrated on the East Coast. But if you go to services, it's the West Coast. So here you have what you can be transmitted through the wideband, the ITC, and all that. So you see a very clear pattern of specialization. These are just the export to Europe. So it's not just the specialization of the states, but is export specialization, not necessarily, production specialization. Now, so one thing which I think is also important is the capacity to enter global value chains and the positioning along the global value chain. The idea is also that different countries in Europe and different states in the United States have very different share of domestic versus foreign value added in their export. And that, again, is a very important element. The global value chain are built around high quality and efficient service provider. And this is one of the reasons why service, as Bernard was pointing out, is very, very important in the relation between US and EU, because there are a lot of global value chain which have firms in US and EU. For instance, logistics, but many other things. Now, of course, different countries, and if you want, different firms in different countries, are positioned in different parts of the global value chain. They can be in the upstream or in the downstream. Downstream is closer to the services because then you have the delivery, the UPS is downstream to a certain extent, and the upstream can be the raw material, can be the design of the product, and then you have all the intermediate phases, which are the production phases. So basically, lowering tariff, for instance, a very different impact depending on whether you are upstream or downstream, because it means how many times and how much domestic and foreign value added you have, because it means how many times what you are importing or exporting crosses the borders. This is true not only for the TTIP, but it's true in general for any trade policy that we may want to consider. So basically, I think I have to rush up a little. This is just an example to give you an idea, for instance, within the same country, like Germany, for instance, different sectors have very different shares of domestic and imported intermediate imports. Look, for instance, here, machinery has the highest domestic content. So it means, what does this mean? That if you try to look at the impact of an increase in export of machinery, for instance, in Germany, first of all, this machinery goes into a lot of other sectors, but especially if you have an agreement on TTIP, it will be much higher, for instance, in the machinery and motor vehicles than in others. So this is just something that you can organize, find with some models, and I think is an interesting way. Now, why are we interested in the heterogeneity? Well, because these obviously have an impact on the different GDP of the countries and the states, but also on the number of jobs. These are just some numbers. I don't really believe the numbers, but there are a lot of models say the number of jobs, whether they are skilled or unskilled workers, whether the wage increase or decrease. As you see, again, there is a very, very, very high heterogeneity in different European countries and a very high heterogeneity in different US states. So even the impact, which is something that politicians care a lot, and so at the end of the story, behind the TTIP, there is a lot of the impact on the job markets is actually important. This is just to give you an idea. This is the estimated percentage, percent TTIP-reliant jobs in the state labor force for US, and this is the absolute number. These are the top 10 states which will get jobs if an ambitious TTIP is signed. Now, why is that? There are publications in the web that can be looked at. Basically, this is, I just make an example, California, it depends on the specialization. It depends on what the country, or the state in this case, produce and export, and where they export, and how many people and how labor-intensive are the different sectors. So I think all these kind of things give you some food for thought. So I'm summarizing, I'm finished my time. My main point is the following. I think that an ambitious TTIP agreement can have a small positive impact on both the US and the EU economies, but in order to know more, we should study much better all the issues which are related to the heterogeneity. And here, the one I mentioned, which I didn't give you data because I didn't have much time, but we can discuss them over the debate, are the specialization, the position along the global value chain, the industrial structure, the firm size, the skilled versus unskilled workers, and all these kind of issues. But also, I think that what really matters is the dynamic impact. When I'm looking at the numbers, 10,000 workers against 5,000 workers, I'm looking at a steady state. I'm looking at a number which is a static number, while the dynamic impact and not being short-sighted for countries and states in the United States, I think is very, very important. So the idea is the following. Any of these agreements will put into motion some changes which will change the productivity of firms, that will change the productivity of workers, that will allocate workers in different way, in some more efficient, usually in a more efficient way. And I think that is very important. The second point that I wanted to say is that an agreement on regulation is likely to lower the export cost and increase the benefit for especially small, medium enterprises. Why? Because the small, medium enterprises are the ones which are traditionally facing obstacles in expanding internationally. But also the small, medium enterprises are the ones which are given an opportunity to join global value chain, and this has changed a lot the picture recently of the interaction between big and large players. It's really an opportunity for them to join. And Bernard was showing before the map of the result of the inquiry, which was done in 2014, about the feeling of people. Now, it's very interesting because one thing which I did into, just out of interest, personal interest, I enter into all the website of the Confederation of Industry of the different European countries. And it's incredibly interesting, the Polish one, which is the one which was the lowest interest in having the TTIP. Now, the Confederation of Polish firms are very much in favor, and if you read the testimonial, are really much on pointing to the fact we are in because we have small firms, and for us this is an incredible lowering of the cost and is an incredible opportunity. I'm going to finish now, and yeah, I'll finish. Basically, the only other thing is that to have a TTIP also open some funding opportunities for firms and ownership relationship within the global value chain, which is important. And the last thing I want to say is there are a number of keys, difficulties still, but what I really care about, and I think in these days, and the leaks have had a role on this, is that in order to achieve an agreement, which I do believe at the end will be beneficial, you really need a very high political commitment. And for instance, the recent declaration of Hollande go in the opposite direction. And I think that if there is no political commitment, it's impossible to have an agreement which is dynamically efficient. Thanks.
Great, thanks a lot. So our next speaker is, what we'll do is I'm going to try and keep quite a bit of time towards the end so that we can have a discussion and a debate. So I'll be a bit tougher on the next two speakers. So Deirdre, go ahead.
Okay, no, but I think that's wise. I'll do my best to not go much over 10 minutes, just so that indeed there is time for a dialogue. Well, I just start very briefly by saying I'm not a usual suspect when it comes to TTIP. I don't follow every single detail. I follow the broad lines of what's going on. And I'm interested in what it tells us about the bigger picture, also in terms of the state of European integration and the state of the European Union, both in the short and medium term. So I will place it in that broader context, and we'll look at the issue more of process rather than substance. And that is obviously speaking to the issue more generally that I do know something about, which is transparency and secrecy, both as it relates to the European Union, but also more broadly. Now, I don't have any sheets, so that also perhaps speeds it up a little bit, but if I did have a sheet, it would have 4 words on it, and they will structure my brief intervention also for the purposes of the discussion. They would be diplomacy, entanglement, resistance, and paradigm shift with a question mark. And I'll come to that at the end. Now, in our opening session this morning, MEP Silvia Costa spoke of the new European cult of diplomacy. While I don't disagree with her, I do think it's being reinforced at the moment. I also would point out that the cult, if you want to put it in those terms, they're her words, of diplomacy, were very much there from the very beginning. The European Union, as it then wasn't, but its predecessors, was not thought of in terms of democracy, but very much in terms of diplomacy. It may have been an international organization of a new kind with more supranational components, but it certainly was very embedded within it the notion, both internally, if I take as an example just very briefly, and I think it's important to understand because we're now in the external domain with international agreements also of this nature, but even internally for a very long time and up until very recently, the Council of Ministers, for example, maintained that the manner in which it deliberated on the content of legislation internally was a diplomatic negotiation among the member states and therefore should be secret. And that is actually, even today, that comes out in court cases and in other arenas. So that is, if you like, a very fundamental part, almost of the DNA, if you like, of the European Union. Now, the context has changed, and I think that's really important. Obviously, and for reasons of time, I'm not going to go into it in any great detail, but the Treaty of Lisbon, very obviously, for the first time ever, included a chapter on democracy, both representative and participatory, and that has been embellished, but also arguably expanded on by the court in various cases that have come about it. So that's the normative framing, if you like, the formal normative framing. But of course, the real world practice may be quite different, and an example that I've just given you of the Council of Ministers. So that was with regard to the internal workings of the Union and its predecessors. But international negotiations in the international arena is, per force also the domain of diplomacy. It's negotiations among with third parties, and that has traditionally taken place in great secrecy. What I would say has changed, but not by TTIP, it has already happened in a whole series of international agreements that have been negotiated with various third parties, in fact, mainly the United States, on things like PNR, terrorist financing, so more in the security domain, is that international agreements by the EU with other parties are, in terms of substance, more quasi-legislative than they previously were. So that's where I see that there has been a shift. And I have actually been saying that, well, not quite for a decade, but nearly. And now, interestingly, there is much more acceptance also with TTIP, but also with others, that is the case. But that forces us to rethink also our rules and our normative framing. So my second word is entanglement. And really what I refer to there is this idea of the rules on secrecy. So rather than talking about transparency, which can mean is often a very ill-defined term, secrecy is generally a lot more specific. And secrecy often refers to systems of classification of documents. And also associated with that are unclassified documents. So it's not only formally classified documents, but it's also the unclassified documents, but that are restricted, that are not made available. And that is obviously a huge problem within the EU, but also it's not a specifically EU problem. And that we have to remember. The biggest category of documents in the EU are what are called limited, which are unclassified but restricted documents, and the lowest level of more formal classified documents, which are restricted documents. And in fact, the leaks in question concern the status of restricted, and we can talk about that in the discussion if there's interest on doing that. But restricted is itself a highly contentious category because it's not the formal, top secret, secret confidential, which are where there is a real necessity for secrecy, and which there must be security clearances and all the rest, which are highly highly limited, let's put it like that, although that doesn't quite work either. But restricted documents are merely maybe disadvantageous in the EU system for the interests of the member states or the EU, and there's no security clearance required. And I think part of the problem is that restricted, they are meant to be also declassified. There is supposed to be an agenda for declassification, but that doesn't necessarily happen. The other problem is that there are huge groups of insiders, if you like, who get these documents now, both in parliaments and elsewhere. So there is also an inequality, if you like, between who gets to see it and engage in the discussion and who doesn't. And I think that's part of the problem here. I don't want to get too technical on that, but if there is, I think it is actually highly relevant. I downloaded some of these documents, I've actually looked at them, and my view is that, but maybe I'm overlooking something, is that there doesn't seem to be something intrinsically in them that could not be declassified, and that would have been the correct way, and possibly that's what should happen now anyway, so that it's, but we can talk about that. Resistance, I'm moving on in view of the time. Resistance, really what I want to say there is, so who resists in a sense? I think part of the debate that plays into TTIP is the accentuated role that the European Parliament has got in this context. But that is not, again, specific to TTIP. That is something that the European Parliament got pursuant to the Treaty of Lisbon and the fact that it now has a veto over international agreements, which has meant, according to certain treaty articles, that it also should be more engaged in the process. And there has been the Commission, with regard to TTIP, has certainly gone much further than it ever did before. But previously, the situation was actually quite bad in the sense that members of the European Parliament were being denied documents that were part of the restricted, but I think also limited in terms of status. So they had no privileged access to those documents, and they had to go to court. So, for example, MEP Sophie in 't Veld, but also others, had to use the public access rules that the EU have, go to court, and then be granted, after the event, of course, but also as a matter of principle, the negotiating mandate. That happened several times. And then when you actually see the text of the negotiation mandate, that's the revealing thing. You realize that, in fact, there is nothing secretive in it, in the sense that it's merely more or less an agenda and a wish list. It hasn't got strategy and that kind of thing. So I think this is the crucial question. Is it necessary secrecy? So of course there is scope for secrecy. I'm not saying at all that there isn't. There must also be, in the core of a negotiation, I mean, that also makes common sense when two sides or multiple sides are trying to agree a common core, there will always be a need for secrecy, but that it should be proven that it is necessary, and also, I think, necessary in the public interest, which is something that gets overlooked. I've already referred to the, part of the problem in the EU, but in the US as well, very much so, is overclassification, that we simply don't, and that we don't have information on who classifies. And also there are certain principles for, and I'll only mention one. It's the principle of originator control, which means that, for example, if one party classifies a document, then the other party can't unilaterally declassify it or make it public. They have to have the formal permission of the other party. So this is something that plays into it. My final point is Commissioner Malmström. Huge progress has been made in terms of what the Commission has actually done. And in March, there was a blog written on, and the title is "The EU Enhanced Transparency in TTIP, a Successful Shift of Paradigm," no question mark. So they're arguing that, there has been a massive shift of paradigm. I would say there has been progress, but it's late, it's after the event, it's after it's been pushed, it's after things are leaked. And I mean, the good thing about that, so I wouldn't say there has been a successful shift of paradigm at all. And now, what I would say is there is an increasing public debate on these issues. There's increasing politicization, not only within parliaments, be they the European Parliament or the national parliaments, but also more publicly. If I look in the Netherlands, for example, there has been a public debate in the sense of, in our newspapers, people taking issue and challenging already in 2014, pre any of the transparency moves by the Commission, and then the Commissioner defending in one of the main Dutch newspapers the stance that had been taken and all of that. So, I mean, that's just an example, but I do see it is it has come out much more beyond a sort of narrow, elitist and expert-based discussion, and that is. But the challenge, and those are my concluding words, is how do we shape the general norms of transparency and its mirror necessary secrecy in the public interest. And I think that's a broader discussion, it's broader than TTIP, that we need to have at the level of the European Union, because now the secrecy rules, so, you know, EU restricted, that's a status, but that is something that was laid down in the Council's rules of procedure. There was no public discussion, no public debate, and my view is we need to not only reform the existing transparency rules, which predate from 2001, that's one aspect of the discussion, but we need to think about a kind of secrecy act, if you like, where we think about what are the limits of secrecy, what are the limits, what is the necessity for secrecy, and what are its limits, and to have a public debate involving with co-decision by the European Parliament, but a public debate on what that might be. And the challenges are huge. You know, it's not only Brit exit, which is obviously dominant, but it's also, again, in the Netherlands, we've just had a referendum on the Ukraine agreement. There may have been a relatively low turnout, but you know, it was overwhelmingly negative. The next thing on the agenda is definitely TTIP. The chances are that will also be negative. And then in terms of the knock-on effect, the domino effect of that in other countries, I think. So the time has come also for the European institutions. I would say, I'm not talking about the US, I'm talking about Europe and the European institutions, to proactively take the lead and not simply respond when it's embarrassed into doing so. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that. Maybe Elena can take up some of these secrecy, transparency issues from her perspective as a former negotiator. But Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm speaking to you as an American who's lived in Europe, in Brussels, for 5 years now. I used to be a government official, as Bernard said. I paid attention for a long time to the nitty-gritty details of TTIP, but I also had the privilege of spending a lot of time traveling around outside the Brussels bubble talking to people about TTIP. Now, I do work for a services company, but as a logistics company, we're a services company that moves goods, which puts us in an interesting situation. So my professional interest in TTIP now is actually quite practical, because UPS relies on trade. Trade is what allows us to continue to do business. You know, we started 100 years ago delivering packages in Seattle, and now I think we move 2% of global GDP every day within Europe and around the world. And I will just, one slight plug, I noticed that EUI has had a 40th anniversary this year. UPS has been in Europe for 40 years now, too. So, you know, I saw there's a lot of discussion about why should there be TTIP. And I saw someone say the other day, I don't know who it was, there's 1 trillion reasons to have TTIP. And that was a reference to the volume of trade between the US and EU. I noticed the slides you showed about the actual cross-border trade, and then the investment, and the just, I think, reinforces how important we are to each other. You know, we have, as UPS, we have 45,000 employees in Europe, and we're one of several companies with big workforces here. When TTIP started, doing a US-EU agreement was not a new idea when it started now 3 years ago. I lost track of time. And, you know, it was something that was contemplated now 25 years ago. And in those days, I think the decision was that the conditions to achieve the kind of agreement that would work for both sides, and let me emphasize that, because the only agreement that's going to be possible is one that works for both sides. This is not a negotiation between a big country and a small country. It's actually not a negotiation between two countries, because the EU is not a country. But two big, well-developed, advanced economic countries with robust regulatory systems that are established in law. But when the leaders got together at the end of 2011, they decided that it was worth a shot to do this agreement now, because it looked like the conditions were there. So what were the conditions? Political will, a need to find more economic growth for the economies on both sides of the water. You know, as you know well, the last 7 or 8 years have been very difficult economically on both sides of the water. There are still large blocks of unemployment. The employment in the last economic difficulties I know in the US has reached more of the white collar. And those conditions on both sides of the water, I think, have really shaken the electorates. And you can see that in the discourse. I mean, I know you probably are aware that we have a presidential election going on in the US. But, you know, in Europe, the political calendar in the next 2 years or so is pretty loaded. You know, starting with the Brexit referendum on the 23rd of June. There'll be an election in Spain 6 days later, I think. Sorry, I was close. You know, then we have French election next spring, German election probably September 2017. You need to have an election in Italy before mid-2018, I think. I just want to say the last time I was in Florence officially was a few years ago, and I remember meeting with an advisor to the mayor. And I said, oh, well, who's the mayor? Oh, he's this young, dynamic guy that's probably going to have a future in Italian politics. Ah, we know him. But the political calendar is pretty heated on both sides of the water. And I think that all of us in the US and in the EU member states are seeing the electorate, are seeing different conditions in the electorate than we've often seen before. And I think TTIP has gotten conflated in that. My experience in Europe when I would talk to people about TTIP, and it almost didn't matter what member state I was in, people would say, TTIP is going to do this. I'd say, well, that's really interesting because that's really not on the agenda. We don't trust Brussels. And after I heard that a couple of times, I realized that TTIP had been in the public discourse, had been mixed in to kind of the post-Lisbon implementation, where Lisbon shifted the gears here a bit, between how to deal with economic austerity, between people in the electorate probably feeling that their futures were not as solid as they wanted them to be, and I say that in the US too. One thing that's a little bit different though, is in the US, you know, the US and EU are longtime allies. We're, in the trade and economic realm, we're longtime partners, but we're also longtime competitors. And with the investment on either side of the water, we are each ingrained in the economy of the other. But my sense has also been that that's not always well appreciated by lots of people that live in our countries, because unless you see it, you often don't know. One of the other issues I heard as I would travel around to talk about TTIP, and I think you mentioned it a little bit, I saw it in your statistics, the issue of global value chains and who plays. And I've heard very specifically, depending on which member state I was in, that Italy's exports to the US are only this. You know, the first time I was in Poland, they say, oh, our exports are very small to the US. And I said, but we're talking about value chains. And you export in Poland, for example, hundreds of millions of dollars in auto parts, but you export them to Germany. And where do those cars go? Well, a lot of them come to the US. And it's hard to capture those statistics because I know the OECD has tried, but we're all living in the global value chains. When I looked at your slide about direct exports, who would favor, which states in the US would be advantaged? And I thought, okay, but some of that you probably can't see because it may be produced in Nevada, goes to Wisconsin, goes to South Carolina, comes to Europe, and those are important issues. You know, the other thing that I think is important in TTIP is that we're two economic blocks largely driven by SMEs. In the US, I think the number is about 98% of our businesses are small and medium size. Some of them function locally, some of them function regionally, some of them function nationally, many or some function internationally. And one of the things that, you know, we've found at UPS is that with the digital age upon us and e-commerce, it's become very easy or easier for small guys to participate in international markets. With the internet, with delivery services. I spent 2 months in the US at the end of last year, and I will admit I was a little bit e-commerce crazy. I was ordering stuff all over the place. And I was kind of astounded at how fast it was. There were almost no limitations. There is tremendous potential in Europe. It's hard to get things delivered to Belgium, not because my company won't send, or FedEx or DHL or any of the local companies, because sellers don't want to sell to Belgium sometimes. I think because they don't want to deal with the complexity of transborder VAT and other issues. So there's tremendous opportunity here. And I think one of the things that was part of the discussion on starting TTIP was two big developed economies that have tough regulations, high standards, our citizens expect certain things. Let's see if we can make those work together. There was never an idea or a plan to harmonize everything because regulations are individual and standards are individual. You know, there's not one regulator that regulates everything in the United States, nor is there in Europe. Autos was an issue that's been discussed. You know, you'd think it would be an easy one because the standards here are very strict. The standards here in the US are very strict. You know, I've never gotten in a European car that I didn't feel was safe, and vice versa. But the standards are different, and the job of the regulators is to ensure the safety of the driver and the passengers and of others on the road. Regulators are tough on both sides of the water. The idea was, could they work better together? And where there were unnecessary divergences, could we come together? Part of what was also in the idea is maybe it was too complicated to deal with settled regulations, but regulations are not static. Regulations evolve over time as technology changes. You know, I'll give you an example in the auto area. Self-drive cars. Those are going to need very robust regulations because, so would it be better to have one set of rules on the EU side and one set of rules on the US? Or would it be in all of our interests for the regulators to talk to each other and come up with the safest and best solutions without a presupposition that they're going to agree, because our regulatory systems are based in law on both sides of the water. One of the other points I'd like to make is I think, trade and investment agreements are not new to either the US or the EU. We've each done lots of trade agreements. In the US, we've done 15. The EU has upwards of 60, I think. They're all out there in the public domain. NAFTA got a lot of attention in the United States. But TTIP has drawn more interest than I think any agreement has ever drawn on either side of the water. And if you're not a practitioner or a lawyer or an economist, I think when you look at the text of an agreement, you think, what is this? Because they're contracts, they're legal documents, and they're often, I think they can be often hard to understand. There's also been, I think, a lack of fact in the discussion. On both sides of the water, there's a lot of emotion and maybe a little bit less fact. There's things like chlorine chicken that have gotten a lot of attention. But I always like to talk about chlorine chicken. I'm not responsible for agriculture in my new job. Food regulators make decisions that they believe are in the best interest of their populace to keep people safe. In the US, we treat chicken in a dilute chlorine rinse. In France, the food rules require that salad be gassed in chlorine. In the Netherlands, the little shrimp that are ubiquitous, shrimp kind of live in the muck. Chlorine is an important part of the peeling process to take the shells off that shrimp. Sometimes when I'm in France, when I used to be in France, people would say, is that true? It is. And that's what the regulator decided was important to protect public health and safety. There's a lot of things out there. Yeah, we're all talking. Why is trade important? I think that's not probably well recognized to our economies. This is an issue in Brexit. What does the membership mean? Okay, so last comment. What are the prospects? I don't know. I think both sides are committed to achieving a high standard agreement that will work for both sides. I think the political calendars is tough. There was a issue of Politico this morning, one of the US EU newspapers, that said, what's the prospect for TTIP? And they asked five personalities, and they got 5 different answers. I think it has a potential to be very important for both economies, and I hope that it succeeds. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. So given that we started late, I'm going to continue and we'll go over a little bit. So we have at least 15, 20 minutes for comments, discussion, questions. So the floor is open. Who wants to start? Sir, please. And if you could introduce yourselves, that would be.
Sure. Thank you very much. My name is Nico Frandi, and I'm currently the Deputy Permanent Representative of Italy to the WTO. I would like, well, first of all, let me thank all the speakers for their presentations. I would like to raise a point or to make a question that was briefly touched in the introduction, but not very much dealt with by the speakers, which is the relation between the TTIP and multilateralism in international trade. There has been a long debate, which is still going on bilateral, plurilateral agreements being the stumbling blocks or the building blocks of multilateralism. And I would like to know how you see the TTIP in this respect. So is it the evidence of a stalemate or even a decline of the WTO, at least in its negotiating function, or it could actually pave the way for further multilateralism in trade? And by concluding my question, let me refer also to Commissioner Malmström, who only a few days ago in Geneva in a public forum at the Graduate Institute referred to TTIP as a done deal, which should tell us a lot about where we stand. And by the way, the title of the speech was on the importance of multilateralism. So if that is, it is also the view of the speakers. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I suggest we take a few comments, questions, and then go back to the panel. So yes, please.
I'm Susan Senior from the University of Siena, and we heard a few comments about agriculture and the fact that there has been some progress on agriculture. And I'd like to ask the panel for a few more details, a bit more discussion of the prospects on this issue.
Alfredo Ferm, former director of the European Parliament, now fellow at the Robert Schuman Center. I think the element of a politicization and involvement of public opinion, so the general issue of transparency is very important, because at the end, this agreement will be submitted at the vote of the Parliament, according to the rules. And if you look back to the precedents, they are not very, let's say, reassuring. ACTA, PNR, even if now it's been adopted, the SWIFT agreement. So I think what is crucial is the communication in this. But then, after listening to very interesting introduction of Professor Giovannetti, I see the figures and the conclusions. There are still a lot of doubts and a lot of, let's say, weak points that need to be developed and to convince, let's say, to support at the end the trade. So which kind of message we can be given on this? Thank you.
Thank you. There's supposed to be a microphone also upstairs, so if there's anybody up there who wants to intervene, just wave and attract my attention. Any other? So, please, yeah, go ahead.
Alessandra Paradisi, I'm Vice Director of the International Relations Department of RAI, the Italian Public Service Broadcasters. As you know, audiovisual has not been included in the TTIP negotiation, but I would like to address a more general remarks and a question. All the speakers that I thank have stressed the economic aspect of this negotiation, but I think that there is one more important aspect from the political point of view that has to be touched. I speak about the democratic way in which this process has been developed. Also, it was one of the points touched by one of the speakers. I think the methodology is very important. People have not been involved really in the decision, the discussion, the debate, and this is a great problem that we have to take into account in the development of the negotiation. This is my first remark, how to involve people in the right way, because we assist to different debates. In one part we have all the people that are in favor of this, and the other part we have the people that are against, and there is no forum in which we can assist to a real debate from both sides of the table. This is my first question. And the second question is, who will be the regulator in the future? We are talking about rules, but it's not clear in my mind who will be the regulator in this new global scenario that we are defining. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Very good questions. Nobody upstairs? If not, then we'll go back to the panel. So Deirdre, you want to start, and then we'll just go down the road.
Well, I'll speak to two of them, I think, that were more my area. So in order, I would agree with you that that communication is very important, but it can't just be communication to the Parliament behind closed doors either. It has to be, and there is an attempt to do that. I mean, TTIP for the first time, rather than just assigning certain documents to reading rooms and being highly restrictive who could have access, etc., is now informing the Parliament as a whole plus staff. So I think there has been a real engagement there. I do think, and that I couldn't say in my speech, but the fact that national parliaments, this is indeed really new for the Commission and very smart of it, because of course national parliaments also really matter. I mean, national parliaments also ultimately have to have a say. There can be a referendum or whatever. So, you know, I would support you, and I would agree that the signs are not auspicious. On the other hand, the European Parliament, you know, has been successful in strategizing this and making sure that it's also included more at the table, that it's informed on the process as it develops and not just at the end. And I think there's recognition now, which is relatively new, that also the national debate has to be incorporated in this, that this is part also of our system of representative democracy. It's not just the European Parliament, it's also the national parliaments. So I think that is wise. And your point, and those I'd limit myself to that also in terms of time, how to involve the people in a real debate. But this is not just TTIP again. If I look at the British exit debate, there it's been highly politicized, but it's enormously polarized. And you know, the man and the woman on the street, just to put it in those terms, like people I talk to, they just aren't getting the facts. They don't know. They don't believe their politicians, you know, who are grandstanding in some way or another for their own, often for their own opportunistic purposes, and they simply want more neutral facts as to. So I've had very interesting discussions, just, you know, in a non-professional context. And the surprising thing that came out of that, already in the context of the British referendum, is that people have this feeling that they can't indeed trust politics, be it Brussels or the national level, but that they want more accountability, they want more sense of that. And so that's something on which they really need progress. So there are no simple answers to your very broad question, but I think it's more than just, you know, for a long time we thought having more democracy in the European Union was to give more powers to the European Parliament, and that would take care of it. I think more powers for the European Parliament are certainly important. They're an element of it, but it will never be enough on its own. It has to be also the national level, national parliaments, but in my view, it also has to be more openness, to use it in a broad term, and publicity, and then to have, not to be afraid of a public debate, and then those that want to engage. I mean, many members of the public won't follow all the detail and won't wish to do it, as often civil society, but the fact, and that's where leaks, for example, play into all of that. They get information out there, so there can actually then be a debate. I'm not advocating leaks, but leaks are a fact of life. They happen everywhere. Where there are secrets, there are leaks. So, and I think your last question is really interesting. Who will be the regulator in future? And I hope one of the other panelists can answer that.
That was an interesting question, but I think I don't suppose in my lifetime that there would be an international regulator, because regulation is the subject of domestic governments. And what happens internationally, there's a lot of there's a lot of regulatory cooperation that happens internationally, including within the EU. But unless governments are willing to give up their regulatory powers, and I don't ever see that the US Congress would, nor would I see that EU governments would, regulation, the regulators would be domestic. You know, there's a lot of regulation already that's local, and wouldn't ever be international because it's about local conditions. It's not about external conditions. The multilateral question. So you certainly know that for the US in TTIP, the lead political negotiator also happens to be the US ambassador to the WTO, which is a good thing. You know, I think from my old government perch, but also from my position at UPS, the WTO and the rules that are there and the GATT before it created a whole lot of predictability and certainty for governments and for traders, you know, starting from the early 50s. And predictability and certainty is important when you trade. There's certainly been a lot of frustration that agreement is harder to get in the WTO now. But the rules form the basis of how we trade internationally. I think, you know, there's an active discussion going in Geneva about what next. But FTAs are also an element of our world. And, you know, maybe there's a little pressure on the two working together. You know, you asked a question about agriculture. I think, I can't really tell you what the progress is because I'm not involved anymore. But I can tell you from what I know that there has long been a cooperation between ag officials on both sides of the water, not only in the WTO in terms of broad rules, but in terms of food safety, because we export product to one another. And there's always been very practical cooperation, including on import alerts. And, you know, the officials on both sides of the water cooperate in a lot of international organizations that talk about agricultural standards and safety issues. And also, you know, about developments in agriculture and technology and regulatory lessons and the whole range of issues. And I think TTIP would only build on that.
A couple of questions were about basically economic versus policy type of position on the TTIP. On one hand, I think that the economic gains and losses are easier to assess because at the end of the story, you use a model. So once you have accepted the assumption, then you have a model and you can see what are the economic outcome of your model. But economics without politics doesn't go anywhere. So I think you do need the policy. Now, in one of the questions, there was the public opinion was mentioned, and I do believe that it's very important to involve the public opinion. The consultation that were done at the European level maybe are not enough. Maybe people are not involved much by this type of consultation. You go on the web page, you can give your opinion, but you don't know exactly what they're going to do with that. And also they're not advertised a lot. But I think one thing that comes out is that people may actually have a too narrow view. So when you actually see yourself in something which is as big as the TTIP, you tend to see, for instance, if you are an entrepreneur, you tend to look at your firms. If you are someone in politics, you tend to look at your country. And I think that's exactly the mistake. that you do. So what you need is really not to avoid the individual. This actually is a problem at the European level now of all the institutions. It's not just on the agreement on the TTIP. This fact that people tend to be much more individualistic, much more closed in themselves. So it's a position of closure rather than openness. And this brings me to the WTO issue, because so I do believe that it's important to involve people, but it's very important to convince them, to show them that you also need the macro point of view. You don't have to focus on yourself. Because, for instance, the gain from the TTIP are dynamic gain. So I may lose today, but I may gain because I gain more from free trade and from the fact that there's a dynamic adjustment with more productive things. And this takes me to the WTO issue, because one of the reasons that triggered the TTIP, because people were discussing about this much before when they started, and then was 2011, 2012 when they started talking, and 2013 when there were the first rounds, one was the crisis, but the other one was exactly the disappointment with the Doha development. So with the round of Doha, so the stalemate of the Doha development. So because of that, they actually enter into the rounds of discussion. And so what I see is that this is not in contradiction, but was a desire of exploiting the benefit of free trade, even though it was on a smaller scale, not at the world level. As Elena was saying, this is difficult. You have a lot of difficulties in reaching a level. But I think that if we are able enough to show the positive spillover of the agreement, then it's going to pave the way to multilateralism. So I actually do believe that is a positive effect.
Okay, so we've pretty much run out of time. I just want to make one remark kind of on, and also reacting to some of the questions. And what strikes me really is that what we have with TTIP, and TTIP is I think the best example, but this is a general issue, is that these trade agreements are no longer just about reducing tariffs, right? So it's no longer just about trade, it is a lot about services, it is about regulation, so it becomes a much more complicated type of endeavor, and that means there's also much more of a need to involve the population, because, as has been said repeatedly, regulators respond to national requirements, regulators have a legal mandate that comes through the national parliaments, etc. So these are not things you negotiate. And I think it's very clear when you talk to the negotiators that the negotiators know they're not going to negotiate about regulation. So I think one of the challenges has been there's this disconnect between how people perceive negotiations in terms of give and take, and what the TTIP is really much more about, which is about facilitating a process through which regulators can actually talk to each other, work together, learn from each other's experience, and improve regulatory outcomes. So I think, and this really goes to the communication point, and I think this has never really been brought out very clearly, very explicitly. So I think the big question you asked with respect to what do you do to overcome these information gaps, I would argue that we really need to have a different approach towards actually developing these negotiating mandates and to have much more involvement by people. And it goes back to something Georgia didn't have much time to talk about, but to think about it in the context of supply chains, for example. Because if you think about specific supply chains, you have very many different stakeholders involved in those. You have a whole host of SMEs who are part of that ecosystem. You have large lead firms. You have workers in all those firms. You have communities. So I think what we need to do is we need to learn much more from political science to actually use techniques that you can bring those groups and those interests together to actually have an informed discussion as to what are the key issues that would actually help make that system work better, including achieving regulatory objectives. And that is something trade negotiators have never really been asked to do. They're not set up to do that, but I think that really is the challenge for moving this process forward, because that will also help them identify what actually matters and what doesn't matter. What should they be focusing on? And I think right now there's still too much of a focus on kind of doing what we used to do in the past, and we do more of that, and that really doesn't work very well anymore. So I think that, and I think it's also a big area for research, right? So in terms of how do you actually design these deliberative types of mechanisms, how do you ensure that they don't get captured by business, how do you ensure, and there's of course, this is what a large part of political science is all about, and I think it's time for the trade community to actually kind of do more to talk to the people who have been thinking about how do you actually do these things at the local level, where these techniques exist. I mean, it's not, you don't need to invent anything new here, but I think you actually have to just invest the resources to do it. So let me end with that and thank the panelists, thank all of you for your questions, and I hope you have a successful remainder of the day, and we'll be enticed to actually go to the sessions as opposed to enjoy the weather.
Say something really cold. Just keep it in mind. Oh yeah. That's the best way to you can choose on the day. Yeah, zero. Says you remain. Ciao. That's cold. I like this thing this evening. Sorry. It's like the
works for Daniela. Are you keeping one? Yeah? I will send you one for Daniela. All right. Appena era un posto per... Sì, si mette qua. Cool isn't
Good morning, everyone. May I begin by introducing myself? I'm Bridget Laffin. I'm director of the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies here at the European University Institute. And it is an honour, a privilege and an enjoyment to chair a session on women and leadership. Leadership is a ubiquitous quality in human life, in human societies and through history and in all parts of the world. And as we know that when it comes to formal leadership historically, women have been absent rather than present. But of course, the first wave of feminism at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, and then the second wave beginning in the 1960s, gradually brought more and more women into the public sphere, into the economic sphere. And what we will try to do today is think through where we have come from, but also where we're going. And I would think a wonderful slogan for us would be 50-50 by 2050. In other words, that we would not just aspire to, but that we would achieve equality by the latest, and this is, of course, equality is a complex issue and topic, but that by 2050, we would no longer live in a world where less than a quarter of the elected politicians in global terms were women. So let's think, I can't think of a better panel to have this discussion. We're very privileged to have Silvia Costa, MEP, chair of the Cult Committee in the European Parliament, that is Culture and Education. She was also a member of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, and it's wonderful to welcome her back to the EUI. We had a discussion with your committee here last September. To my right, and I'm introducing people in the order on the panel. To my right, Professor Yvonne Galligan. I can't think of another academic I would want here to discuss this topic today. Yvonne has directed or directs the Centre for the Advancement of Women in Politics, and all of her academic career has researched and written in comparative terms on women in democracy and women in politics. To my extreme left, to my left, Joa Getzi, by training a physicist, but interestingly was the first woman to receive the London Business School Executive MBA grant. And that must be an extraordinary achievement, because I know business schools, they're very tough environments in general, and particularly, I suspect, tough for women. Joya has 25 years of management experience now as part of Zurich Insurance Group, but also is president of the Italian state railway system. I won't attempt to say it in Italian. My pronunciation may not be sufficiently accurate. And then our fourth speaker, Christina Jacki, it is Deputy Mayor of Florence, and again it's wonderful to have both the European level, that level of politics, the local level, the comparative, and also the business dimension. So I regard this as an extraordinary privilege, and I look forward very much to our discussion. And I want very active participation from the audience in what is an extremely important and interesting topic, not just for women, but for humankind and for the way we are in the world. So can I begin immediately by asking Silvia Costa to introduce her ideas about this topic on women and leadership. Thanks.
Many thanks. I'm very, very happy to be with these interesting interlocutors and also rapporteurs. I would like to start recalling that the leadership of women is increased in last decades, and also for the legal basis, the different and the new legal basis that we provide also in EU. And we can say that starting from the Treaty of 57, in which, as before Mr. Gozzi recalled, the basis was only on the same wage, not the equal pay for workers. And so sorry because my English is not perfect, but I count on your smart minds. I try to be clear. But if you consider in a deep way this, it's not a concession, as a gift for women, but it's more linked to the worry about the competitiveness between workers inside Europe. And so, but this little door was opened more by the movement, the policies and the strategies, but also the politicians, but also supported by women, opinions, leaders, and so on, around Europe. And this little openness became a policy, just to say in a very, very few words. And is thanks to this movement in a different way, with different culture, with different times, also inside, around Europe, that we now can consider in a very different the very different basis, legal basis. It's important to recall it, because not so, expected thing is the fruit of a fight. Now, in the Lisbon Treaty, we have not only the equal pay or the equality in a general views, but as you know, in some articles in the Charter of Fundamental Rights that now is inside the Constitution. It's not a charter apart. And so this is a principle of constitution with a different range of commitment. And on the other side, on some articles inside the treaty, we have, for instance, that the gender equality among is a key values and objectives. And in the Articles 2, the third now is within a comma that the EU shall combat social exclusion and discrimination, shall promote, and so in a positive way, not only against something that is the obstacle, but also to promote social justice and protection, equality between women and men, solidarity between generations, and protection of the rights of the child and others. And also EU is committed on the mainstreaming and empowerment as main tools to enlarge and wide the policies, including this external and development policy. That's another part that today is very, very important. And so for us, for us as women in the parliament, not only for women, fortunately, I'm very glad that some men, very heroic man, is also here, because for me, first of all, we normally run the risk that these kind of items we discuss only among women. We lose something, saying, because I know that if we propose these items in a different way, is very useful to involve also men. In any case, and so we consider gender inequality and the lack of leadership, family leadership, not only is also moral, social problem, but also a critical economic and social challenge, and so also for the democracy. And so is this approach in a horizontal sense that we want to go on. And so it's very important because we take in the same consideration political representativeness, with the leadership in politics and democracy, in the governments, in the institutional bodies, but also in decision-making process, but also in social organization. I would like to avoid the one risk that sometimes in the last decades we copy with. The risk to consider only the top. For me, this is a result. Because otherwise we can make a mistake to make some confusion between the leaderships that come from a process and from commitment, and also not only at an individual level, but also choral, community level, also among women, with the cooptation, you can say cooptation, by male, of leadership of women. That's one of the risks that I saw, and for me, it's very, very important to link together the democracy processes, the social empowerment of subjects, also because you know that in the beginning of the history of the participation of women to the policy, I remember, because I'm one of the oldest here, I remember that in the beginning, when the politics was mostly men guided, the women was obtained their results, and there was taken in consideration also they aware of their strengthness inside other aspects of the life, no? Not only in family also, but also in association, in trade unions, in scholarship, for instance, in the management of schools, of communities, and in economics, and in entrepreneurship. And then in studies, research, etc. And then they decide to have a larger perspective to achieve also this level. Just to recall a little a part of the history. Second, we are making some progress. They have to recognize this, as you said before, for this, also because you have this precious paper with some figures. I want just to mention two things. The first is that inside the company, you remember the company board positions, no? Allora, we have this is a recent history. Because in the previous legislature, we fought a lot in a farm committee at the beginning in a very few people, and then it became a larger horizontal fight to obtain a directive, but we didn't succeed the directive, but in any case a communication, very important communication, and also an agreement between the commissioner with board CEOs around Europe. And this communication and the fight was to obtain, inside 2020, 2018, almost 40% inside the public companies. And in the 2020, we had to verify, to monitor, the 40 in other company, come si dice, quotate in borsa. Quoted. And at the beginning it looked as an impossible goal, but in only 6 years at the European level, with different, normally, different average, we start from 11% and now we are in a quarter. It's not so much. It's about 25% of members of the board of companies. And in many, but the important thing is that as in previous years, it happens, for instance, for directive on maternity leave, directive on parity, equal work, equal pay for workers, women and men in 77, then on parental leave or directive on other aspect of the life of women, that Europe succeeds to push national legislation to go on. And at the beginning of this fight, only 3 or 4 countries had these laws, and now, including my country, fortunately, we had the laws on this. And so this is the process that normally we follow. Second thing, but just to be very short, in my previous speech at the beginning, I recall some aspect of the global objectives and the global some of the global goals recalled by the World Economic Forum, etc., and the new agenda for 2030. And in some aspects, we now at the world, not only European level, the leadership, the female leadership is going on. For instance, some figures in the parliament. In the national parliaments, we are around 19%, but with some very different situation also inside Europe. For instance, more than 30% in the north, and very less in not only in the south, but in some countries. In European Parliament, we are now at more than 33%, is a very high quota, but it's interesting that also 18% on ministers, and the new leadership of women is also tested by a thing. In the last 10 or maybe more than 10 years, the field in which women are ministers are not the social affairs, labor, women affairs, etc., but in a very, very interesting, and also inside the Commission, we have half commissioners women, and in a very, very interesting field, for instance, competences, not for competitiveness, but also for foreign affairs, as Mogherini. And so this is another kind of the changement of the power, feminine power, not only to be in the segregation of some fields, but also to discover and to explore. Third, sometimes, and this first, I want to be shorter, is in 2013, we decided inside the parliament to establish this method of mainstreaming inside any committee. We have 20 committees inside parliament. And in any committee, there is a person, a member, in charge to follow and to ensure the mainstreaming of attention to pay to women's condition, to women impact in any kind of work. That's very interesting. It's not only confined to FAM committee. It was a little mistake, not that we did in the past, because sometimes we are a library, because we have some committee, they do some reports on some matters, specific matters, and that's on. Now we are all committed to this, and sometimes it's not easy, because sometimes some aspect of our, for instance, we are in this moment, just to recall three strategy. Digital strategy. I'm very interested to know by you, some to receive also some support, or some indication, and some suggestions, because we know that in the digital single market, we say digital economy, social and economy, and not only single market. In any case, this is the very biggest in this moment challenge that we have. And we will decide for the next decades how many, in which position, with skills, and with new model of leadership, very different models, more horizontal, more for, and maybe more, connects, close to the characteristics of women for me. But it depends on the process, on the itinerary, on the skills that we compete. Allora, we have two combined challenge. The digital strategy and the new skills package, how we can manage. I am very, very interested to have also a contribution by EU Institute, because, as I said when we met on September, if you allowed me to say this, we are very interested in Parliament to understand better which kind of relationships and support and reciprocally cooperation we can do, because you are in a fantastic international leadership of the thought, the studies, the research, and we need young thought, young in the sense of thought, young policies, not only made by young people, it's another thing. Second, we have another kind of strategy that for me is very important, as I mentioned before, is the cultural diplomacy, etc. It's not only one way, it's international, it's culture, research, and education, more central in international relationships by EU, because we discovered, someone discovered, I was already aware of this, that without a culture education dimension of the external relationships, cooperation relationships, security relationships, but also economic challenge, we have, and so investing in human resources, we don't go anywhere. And we now are recuperating this aspect, this dimension inside the Parliament, because at the beginning, as you know, inside the 10 priorities of the program of Juncker, the word culture, education, and research is not mentioned. It's implicit, but it's not so easy to fund implicit policies. And so we have to work also on this. And the third aspect is culture. We are exploring a new field, not new field because it's new, because there's a new policy by European Parliament, and my strategy, not personal, but also with my committee, is to go on a horizontal approach, for instance, culture and industries, culture and external relationships, culture and skills, and also culture and labor market. In this framework, we are now preparing a very important report on cultural and creative industries in Europe. I saw my very close friend, that she's very, very committed on this, as Christina and other Florentine people that I know so well. This is a very promising new sector because normally is considered in the margin of industrial policy. Is not so important for culture, no? But we have to cross, because in this moment, this is represented 6% of GDP, European GDP, 1 million of entrepreneurs, enterprises, sorry, and about 8 million of workers. It is a very, very crowded of women. As last, on the 2018, just to give more future to our opportunities, no? For young women in particular to be leader. We have to prepare to mainstream the leadership of women in the new promising sector of strategy and new perspective of a European policy that is more connected with the skills and with the culture and education items. This is the culture and creativity and cultural heritage. I don't know if you know, because it's a recent news, that we succeeded a very, very difficult fight, also as Italian, but not only as Italian, but as Europeans, is declared now, finally, 2018, as European Cultural Heritage Year. That's very important, the preparation of this, because this is a new perspective that we give to a very important matter that in this last legislature is a little not mentioned, no? Because before is the financial instrument, economic instrument, and so just to say, I conclude, just to say that when we speak about leadership, women leadership, we sometimes consider mainly other sectors. But we undervalue how high level and how professionals are women inside these sectors, and the fact that these sectors now finally is more central in European strategy is a way to consider in a different way also the perspective of leadership of women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I move immediately to the second speaker, to Yvonne Galligan, who has, I hope we can get the slides. Where did the slides disappear? Oh, yeah. No? Are they down here? No? He's coming. Just one moment.
Perfect. Perfect.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and thank you also for the invitation to be here. And it is my great pleasure to be in the EUI, returning to the EUI, where 2 years ago I spent an absolutely wonderful period of time as a research fellow with Bridget. And thank you again for being part of such a distinguished panel. As an academic, I can only value and treasure the experience of the other women speakers here today. What they are saying is really a lived experience that academia can never match. So let me begin and by drawing attention to this picture. You're probably wondering, what's this picture all about? In her opening remarks, the chairperson, Bridget Laffan, gave me the perfect introduction. She said that we should aim to have a society right across Europe and elsewhere, hopefully globally, that by 2050 we will have equal numbers of women and men sharing leadership, sharing power, and together making decisions, public decisions that benefit all of us. And this picture illustrates that to some extent. It illustrates where we are at the moment. It's called Out of the Shadows. It is by an artist from Northern Ireland. Her name is Michelle Rogers. And it was commissioned by women in my university to represent the participation and the contribution that women have made through the years and the decades to the life of the university. At the time that was commissioned, we had no pictures of women in our university. So this was a big, bold statement. And I think this represents the sentiment that you opened this panel with, which is women coming out of their shadows to take their place alongside men in making the decisions that matter for all of us. So in that framework, I would also like to remind you of something that Margaret Wallström said back in 2009 that I would like to explore a little bit in my talk. And that is, she said that unfortunately, at the top levels of decision making, back in 2009, it was still very male dominated. And this is what I want to interrogate in terms of the European context, not so much at the EU level, where Silvia Costa has just addressed with great eloquence, but at member state level and across member states. So if we begin at the top and look at prime ministers and heads of government, when we do the sums and we add it all up, we find that since 1990, which is pretty much a generation, we have had 13 females in the role of prime minister or head of government. I'm quite sure that by 2050, we will have changed that completely. But this is where we are right now, women just beginning to take these steps forward. Today, as heads of state, we find that it is also a heavily male-dominated role. Only the directly elected presidents of Lithuania, Malta, and Croatia, along with the monarchs of the UK and Denmark, are women. Thus, women comprise only 18% of EU heads of state in 2016. So a little bit of work to be done there. During the 1990s, the proportion of women in government in the European Union was 16%. By 2014, 2015, that increased to 28%, which reflects the average proportion of women across all the parliaments in the member states. So there's a clear correlation there, and I think that's an important thing to remember. So there's a slow pace towards equality, and in this there are some gender differences are apparent. In 2014, when we look at government, we find that in 2014, women held 48% of socio-cultural ministries, ministries of health, education, social welfare, family, etc., and less than 1/2 of the economic ones. Now, that is little change from the 1990s, when research by Rebecca Davis showed that women occupied 1/2 of the socio-cultural ministries in the member states of the European Union, in the 15 member states at the time. So there are some points of stickiness that we can address. And this is where role models are important, and the role model that the European Union is putting forward in terms of the roles that the commissioners hold is a very important signal to member states in that regard. Party leaderships, too, are a male-dominated space. In 2014, 19 women were national party leaders, compared with 125 men. But interestingly, of the deputy leadership positions, 1/3, or 57, were held by women. So women are there at the second tier of leadership. And so this is something we will be coming back to in a moment. In terms of women's parliamentary representation across European Union member states, there have been obvious, though incremental, improvements in women's representation. In 2003, 11 EU countries had fewer than 20% female MPs. So that's 11 in 2003. In 2016, there were only 6 countries in this category. So that suggests progress. In 2003, at the upper end, 8 European Union countries had more than 30% women MPs. In 2016, there were 11. So again, we can see a push forward, a gradual increase in women's representation. When we look at women holding top senior civil service positions, so level 1 in the senior service across the European Union, we find that by 2014, women held 1/3 of the top senior civil servant positions across 11 member states, including some countries where women's representation in parliament is not all that great, such as in Slovenia, where women civil servants occupy 50% of the top posts, and Romania, similarly, and Greece, which is close to parity. So sometimes in countries where women's leadership is required, women find it easier to make it through to the top administrative channels rather than through the top political channels. So these facts point to the continued glass ceiling for women in political life, though on the more positive side, there are signs that across EU member states, the thick layer of men is beginning to thin somewhat. But let me, for the moment, now turn to what it is that this uneven pace of change says. The supply side. So there have always been arguments that women do not come forward because they lack the confidence, they lack the skills, they have family commitments, they don't have the finances to support it, etc. And all of these are relevant up to a point. When women are in positions which enables them to take leadership, these issues are not quite as relevant any longer because the issue of, for example, candidate selection, if you're a member of parliament, doesn't apply for that mandate. The issue of childcare and family balance is one that women, when they get to the top leadership tables or close to it, usually have found ways of resolving, either through their own practical measures or through supportive measures around them. So, in a way, what we really need to tackle and need to address is the issue of culture, because that ultimately remains the thing that creates the stickiness that prevents the women from becoming equal partners with men in decision-making. Tackling the cultural bias towards males in political leadership has brought about a range of actions. Some encourage the participation of women in political life, such as highlighting of role models. And indeed, the Portuguese Women Can Do It project is an example of that. Candidate mentoring programs, so mentoring women into political leadership, such as that run by the German Helen Weber College, is another example of the actions that can be taken to support and develop women into political leadership. Another, such as Women for Election in Ireland, focuses on building women's campaign knowledge and representational skills. So giving women the knowledge to campaign for political office. Other measures are more direct, such as introducing by political parties voluntary or legislated candidate gender quotas. And quotas, either voluntary or legislated, have actually done a good job in increasing women's political representation over the last 15 years. And 7 EU member states today have legal provision for this in their national politics. And so I'm just going to put up the countries that have the legal provision next, mindful that there are many countries that have voluntary measures in place, but it's often the legal measures that attract the most attention. And by and large, and so here we have a slide of these different provisions and the countries, and importantly, the sanction that applies if the legislated requirements are not addressed. And as you can see, there are quite some push measures there for political parties to address candidate gender balance in those countries. The net effect of introducing these, we can see it here in this part. You can see the position in 2001, which is the blue bars in each of the countries we have spoken about, and the position today in the red bars. And you can see that in each of these instances, there has been, in many instances, quite a significant increase in women's representation, by and large to do with the enactment of the quota law. The Belgian case was good to begin with, but that's because it had a quota law in existence before this slide, the date of this slide. So that explains Belgium. We can see even in France, there has been a very significant increase due to its parity law. Even though it's a complex issue, the implementation of the parity law in France. We can see, for example, in Slovenia, going from 13% in 2001 to 37% in today in 2016. When one looks at that more closely, that is due completely to the introduction of the gender quota law in that country. And it happened much later than 2001, happened around 2011. So here we have a representation that shows us that quotas make a difference. But why do they make a difference? And does it matter that it's just more women in Parliament? Maybe it matters as much to raising women's aspirations in general society, to political leadership, or to leadership more generally. Because often the old adage of you cannot be what you cannot see really applies. And we find that the concern to address women's absence from political leadership comes from a wish to legitimize democratic politics and to empower women's participation in democratic politics. As Susan Burrell's widely cited observation puts it, that women in public office stand as symbols for other women. And that's really important, and it goes right across the board in terms of all forms of leadership. Women in positions of leadership stand as symbols for other women, not just in terms of aspirations, because although that's incredibly important, but also as symbols that these are roles that can be filled by women, and that assists with the pipeline. It increases the pool of those eligible and available to serve at the next level of leadership, which is why it's so important that 1/3 of deputy party leaders are women, and why it's so important that 1/3 of the top administrative posts are held by women. So, the issue of symbolic representation is becoming more and more important, because with symbolic representation we can begin to tackle the question of culture. As Carol Pateman writes, the political lion skin has a large mane and belongs to a male lion. It is a costume for men, and indeed leadership of many kinds is a costume for men. When women finally win the right to don the lion skin, it is exceedingly ill-fitting, which just goes to show that we have to shape the skin of leadership to suit women's leadership as to suit that of male leadership. And so we find that in numerous parliamentary buildings, women's washrooms have had to be added, since the architects of these buildings have not thought that one day they would need to be designed for women. Other symbols that accentuate the turning of parliamentary and other buildings from male spaces into inclusive spaces are the paintings on the walls, hence the painting in our university. The everyday life of parliaments reproduces maleness in other aspects. Research has shown how women MPs, as well as MPs from other underrepresented groups, women and men alike, adopt and adapt their language, their style of clothing, their body, and their voices to fit the dominant mode of operation and the dominant norms of that institutions. Women think twice of how to dress for parliamentary work. They try to change their voice so as to be taken more seriously by their male peers. Evidence shows that in parliamentary discourses and debates, they are interrupted more often than their male colleagues. Much of the practice and rituals take men and their way of behavior as a male norm. In this respect, the symbolic representation that underlines parliaments is a representation of profoundly gendered institutions, a genderedness that goes far beyond the fact that women are underrepresented in numbers alone. And a focus on symbolic representation reveals that gendered nature. It also helps us shift the focus from women elected representatives to the institution and putting the burden on women elected representatives to always represent women, to looking at the institution itself as a setting in which not only men, but also women elected representatives should be free to function in a way that respects them as they are. The recognition of the gendered nature of parliaments underlines the fact that institutions matter and have an impact on the options that we choose. So, in conclusion, our question then must move beyond the focus on individual women's personal achievements, though these are important in their own right and a basis for moving forward. It must also move beyond expecting women to always act for women. And indeed, the idea that women are a monolithic group with shared interests for whom representation is carried out in a singular collective manner is certainly challenged by notions of intersectionality and diversity among women and men. Today, when examining women and leadership, we need to attend to the context in which this leadership is carried out. We need to ask, what are the inhibitors and what are the facilitators of full expression of women's leadership capacities? Only when we incorporate this element into our analysis and practice of leadership will that thick layer of men erode, and leadership will finally become a layer of equals.
Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Jill Getzi, who will speak on women and the economy and brava. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. It's a great honor and privilege to be here. Bridget, I need to ask you to keep me at bay because I'm so passionate about this topic that I'm afraid I can go on forever. I've started working, as Bridget said in the introduction, over 25 years ago. And I want to bring here the perspective of business and women in business in Europe. So forgive me for sharing a couple of things about myself. I'm Italian, as you can hear from my thick accent. I'm an economic migrant and left Italy, and I've been working in 3 different European countries over these 25 years. And I'm still based in the UK, work in Switzerland, and I am chair here of the Italian Railways, which is one of the most important realities in business in the country. I've also worked for 4 different American companies, and so I've seen the differences of women in business in the US, Canada, and Europe. And the first message I want to give is a positive one. We've come such a long way. When I started working for IBM all those years ago, there was 1 woman director. And, you know, without you starting to Google who it was, she was the fiercest woman I've ever met. And she had to. So, you know, thanks goodness, the reality is very different today. Women are represented, women are in the workforce. And we have a voice, we are heard, big companies have policies on diversity and inclusion, the debate is open. So my first message to you is a very positive one. The second wave that Bridget mentioned of women's strives and fights has made a gigantic difference in business. However, we are not yet there. We are not 50-50. So some figures, and I want to bring the Italian Railways, where I've been involved now for 2 years, and I have the great privilege of leading as the chair since November last year, as an example. In Europe, it was said before in the plenary, we have 64% of women in the workforce, 76% of men. In Italy, that percentage goes down to only 50% of women in the workforce, while we have 3/4 of men in the workforce. In the Italian railways, how many women overall do you think we have? Just a guess. 20? 25? Yeah, overall? 14%, 1-4. It's a very male-dominated environment. There are patches that are very different from that, but overall we are 14%. If you look at train conductors, that percentage goes down to 1.5%. If you look at other realities we have in sales and the commercial side of things, we are at 46%, so about 50-50. Amongst the staff, it's 38%. But still, in management and at executive level, the percentage goes down to 16-17. So slightly more than the average we have of 14%, but still far too little. Now, the Italian Railways is perhaps an extreme example, but it's a very important example. It's one of the biggest employers in the country. And the percentages will be different, better, but still very far from 50-50 at most European, not just Italian companies. So I want to stop for a second before I try to explain why this is happening and what solutions we can put in place to address this issue, to just ask ourselves, why do we need to tackle that from a business point of view? Why do we have to have 50-50? Because until we answer that question, nothing will change. And the answer in business, I'm afraid, is not a values answer, but needs to be a business answer. And thanks God, in the long strides we've made in the past 50 years, but especially in the last 10-15 years, we've made study after study after study that shows that it makes a lot of business sense to have diversity in business. And gender diversity is the first issue. It's not the only issue, but it's the main and most obvious one to tackle, and then we can tackle other ones as well. And the point on diversity, it's a fundamental one, and I think it's a linchpin between the issue of women and the issue of immigration that we are also debating over these 2 days. And the fear of diversity and the fear of the stranger and what is different is a fundamental point that is hindering women in business, and it's fueling a wave of nationalism at the moment across Europe. And they have the same root, I believe. But study after study has shown that more diverse companies are more profitable, more resilient, long-standing. I'm very familiar because I was for many, many years a partner at McKinsey with the studies from the McKinsey Global Institute. They're just one set of studies. There are the studies from the World Economic Forums. There are hundreds of them that show the positive impact of the GDP. One anecdote. Professor Boris Goisberg from Harvard Business School was recently invited by the Japanese Prime Minister, who was here last week, Prime Minister Abe to run a number of workshops in Japan to bring and discuss the issue of bringing more women in the workforce. Goisberg asked Abe, why do you care so much? And Abe replied, I don't care. I don't care about women. My issue is an economic issue. As we all perfectly know, Japan has been in the doldrums for decades now. To trigger the economy, he says, I would need either many more young people in the economy, and that means waiting for a generation, and I can't. I would need to trigger an enormous immigration wave, and there are enormous complications with that, and I cannot do that now at the level of education that I need. But I do have 50% of my population that is phenomenally well educated, and if they enter the workforce, my GDPs would increase very, very rapidly in the space of 3 to 5 years by 1-2 percentage points. So I don't care about women, I do care about the business sense that bringing women into the economy makes. So again, it may seem very frivolous while we are here discussing the issues of immigration, climate change, healthcare issues, obesity, wave, violence against women, to discuss about the exact percentage of women at executive level. It may seem frivolous, it is not. Unless we bring more women into the workforce, we will have no integration, no freedom. Unless women are economically independent, they will not be free of violence. Unless women are in the workforce, we will continue to have humanitarian crises. So it's not frivolous at all, it's part of the same fabric and discourse. So why do we have such stark differences in women in the workforce? Again, the issue has been studied at length, it's very complex. There are numbers of reasons. The fundamental ones rest, I think, in 2-3 big buckets. First of all, choices of studies in women. Women still go for the majorities, the women who are well educated and skilled, into so-called humanitarian, or arts and sciences studies. And so there is a mismatch between labor demand and the skills of women. There is still a phenomenal burden in terms of care that is on women's shoulders. That is changing. Yeah. Young men want to be very involved fathers. At least towards children, it's changing. Data shows that we are not yet there when it concerns caring for elderly family members. But at least concerning children, and the wave is changing slightly, but the burden is still there. There are issues of then inside companies, it's very hard to be a woman. How many times have I been the only woman, the only, for example, non-Anglo-Saxon in my case, in a room, and again, the person who is different and looked at differently. So it's hard to be in the workforce, you're making very hard compromises at home, and you give up. And then there are issues that are much more subtle of unconscious biases against women. And both women and men have been demonstrated to have unconscious biases in favor of young people and in favor of men when it comes to making choices and promotions. I would like to prompt you, if you have not done that yet, to try and do the IAT tests. Forgive me, I do not remember what IAT stands for, but they are tests that check implicit aptitude test. There are tests where you can check against your own unconscious bias on a number of dimensions. Unconscious bias is towards gender issues, race issues, sexual orientation issues, etc. And all of us have biases, terrible biases we do not to confess even to ourselves. But once you are aware of a bias, then you can control for it. And the biases are there, in talent reviews of people, strong women are opinionated or loud, strong men are leaders, and, the language, the culture is different. So, a number of reasons, some very obvious, some less so, that hinder the growth of women in organization. At the Italian Railways, we have taken a number of initiatives. We have a very, very involved leadership at the level of the board, the chief executive, and obviously myself. And we've set ourselves goals that are, very clear targets. I espouse very much having, very numerical and measurable targets, like 50-50 by 2050. We will achieve those targets through a number of very measurable and concrete actions in terms of attracting more women into the type of studies that lead to work in the railways, engineering studies, technical studies already at the level of high schools, in a number of initiatives to support women in the organization to make that step from staff into management and into the executive layers, and a number of steps which is complicated, as you can imagine, when you manage railways, to compensate for work-life balance. But so this is what we are doing at the railways. In general, I think there are 5 types of actions that businesses can take to advance women. These are actions in terms of flexibility in work around the care side of things, skill building. There are differences in men and women, and this has been demonstrated over and over in terms of just even the way women write their CVs compared to them. If you don't believe me, do a blind test as soon as you can, even today. Mentoring and sponsorship, active sponsorship of women. Take every man, every director in your organization, make them actively sponsor a woman. Networking, fundamental. And then, obviously, role modeling. I want to touch on one more thing, quotas and affirmative action. The older I become, and more experienced, and the more radical I become. Without...
In the beginning, I'm also soft.
Absolutely. If, gently pushing the issue was sufficient, we would be there. If, our feminist mothers had done enough, my generation would see 50-50 in business. It's just going too slow. And, when I was younger, I would have hated the notion of having any role because of quotas. I wanted a role because I was good enough to have that role. Now I think the opposite. Am I the chair of the Italian Railways because the Golfo Mosca legislation in Italy has put quotas on boards? Most probably. Do I care? No. I grabbed the opportunity and I'm still... I think, I'm still better and I can make a difference to that company more than 100 men who could have had the role without deserving it. I just will conclude now with one alarm bell, which is the following one. Who is under 30 in the room? I'm not, but just under 30 years of age? Okay, very few. I'm sure I'm not talking about you, but I observe in some younger generations the bias, both in young men and in young women, that feels this was your issue. It's not ours. We are, of course, much more open. My young, male friends at university are not like, those horrible biased guys you had to deal with. And so this does not concern me. Do not get fooled. Do not get fooled. The issue is there. And now, where, the easiest part, in a way, the more blatant discrimination is over, the issue has become much more subtle, much more difficult to demonstrate. Whenever, again, in a business organization or, at a university, you are doing a talent review, you are discussing a promotion, she's not quite yet there, versus he can take this challenge, even though, is phenomenally harder to tackle. So I beg all of you, older and younger, not to lower your guard. We'll get there, hopefully before 2050. Let's aim for the 50-50. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now our final speaker, Cristina Giacchi.
Thank you. Thank you for the great honor to be here as a speaker. I would love to with a little history. In the spring of 1558, a pamphlet entitled "The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women" appeared in England. It was written by John Knox, a Scottish Calvinist. And it arrived when, in the same year in which Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII, had become Queen of England. Knox analyzes, he was a fierce opponent of Mary Stuart's government and a skilled polemicist and supporter of the theory according to which people had the legitimacy of political power has to be legitimated by people. Knox emphasized that clear inability of women to exercise a supremacy for which other skills, such as strength, courage, Machiavellian dissimulation, were needed. In a word, the typical male virtues that for millennia made explicit the categories of dominion and allowed men to ferociously criticize the idea itself against the nature of the powers of the so-called Eve's daughters over society. 16th century treatises have always argued that the inadequacy of women to exercise control due to their weakness resulting from both the imbecillitas sexus and their incapability to be uncompromising impartial in judging. So they were not able. And the sovereigns, female sovereigns, were portrayed as slaves to unspeakable vices, always. More generally, political treatises and misogynist polemics have downsized the clamorous prominence of queens and regents from the 16th century onwards, and have passed over silence the frequency of female presence in the government of large empires and dominions, where until the end of the 15th century, women were admitted to succession in the absence of male heirs. Tombeur and quenouille was the phrase that was used to describe, with regret, this unfortunate event and the consequent effects of instability and disorder, that is the breaking of dynastic continuity through the male line, singled out as one of the main causes of conflict to redefine the balance of power in the European geopolitical framework. We can't forget that for disputes relating to a challenge to female succession were fought wars such as the 100-Year War. I will pass over. A certain feminist historiography has placed the emphasis on ideologically laden complaints regarding the exclusion of women from all spheres of authority and command, depicting them as perennial victims of male oppression. More recent studies have highlighted the networks in which, at various times and across very dissimilar contexts, women have exercised power and significant influence. From the management of crafts and trades in modern urban systems to the mobilization of judicial and welfare apparatuses capable of ensuring family stability, to the skillful weaving of views and destinies in the course and social or cultural gatherings in recent centuries. Women's history has demonstrated how female powers would be declined in the plural, and, above all, how they would call into use an adjective which would soon become an integral part of its interpretation. Throughout the modern age, female powers were informal, gained with experience and practice, excluded from codifications and laws. It will be only from the beginning of the 20th century, not surprisingly called the century of rights, that women will seek capacities legally recognized that had hitherto only been informally recognized in social practices. Beyond history, other disciplines have observed the relationship between women and power, sociology, anthropology, political philosophy. The experts of these disciplines have become more sensitive to the stimulus offered by the category of gender. They've brought to the fore scenarios and perspectives that have contributed to make sharper images still with too low resolution. To do this, they use the categories of micro and local, decisive not only to better understand the contradictory nature of the processes in place, but also to track, forecast, and project not spoiled by ideology. It has been over 50 years since Sirimavo Bandaranaike became Prime Minister of Sri Lanka after the assassination of her husband in 1960, and almost 40 since Isabel Perón became the first woman in the world to hold the position of head of state of Argentina in 1974, again after her husband's death. It's not so good for the man. These stories, which may seem only dynastic question, actually have permitted the access of women to important positions in world politics. We cannot trust on this, obviously. A still marginal role, if you consider that among, we had the number by Yvonne before, 339 heads of state in power now, only a few dozen are women. Europe is the continent which has the highest number of women leaders that goes from Queen Elizabeth to Frau Merkel, obviously. In recent decades, the most prestigious international institutions, from the UN to the Interparliamentary Union and so on, have devoted an important and productive part of their resources to collect data capable of describing the gender difference from many different points of view, from health to education, employment, political participation. And if some of the demographic figures are alarming, from the millions of missing women to girls aborted or left to die in Asia in order to save the family the burden of a heavy and mandatory dowry, the death of Amartya Sen in 1996. The figures of professions and institutions appear frankly depressing, as we heard by the description of Gioia. Not just for the small number of women working within them, something we know and expect, given that less than a century has passed since women acquired such fundamental rights as active and passive suffrage, the abolition of marital authorization prohibiting women from disposing of their assets, and from pursuing an independent economic activity, but also because of the very slow and discontinuous rhythm of their growth, a rhythm that makes it clear that the removal of legal restrictions has not opened the way to coherent linear progress in economical and political emancipation, and how consequently it is necessary to look for more complicated and hidden connections in the relationship between women and exercise of power. The answer is not, however, to merely invoke more or less paternalistic new provisions to overcome what appears to be mechanisms of profound exclusion put in place by the male political class against women, and to change completely the non-involvement of women in the political game. To interpret these trends, perhaps it is necessary to make a deeper analysis of the structure of the measured democracies and the systems of training and reproduction of the political class, in order to uncover the mechanisms behind dominant power networks and family relationships. In that the regulation phase that characterizes the political systems of many Western democracies, traditional parties that control and select political careers with clear rules no longer exist. In the political formations of this new century, it seems that networks will be the most decisive aspect, and even more, the criteria of access to these networks. And the access to political systems based on networks introduces a new distinction, the one between insiders, those who are firmly inserted in the internal trade networks, and the outsiders, those who do not have experiences and relationships that can promote and support access and permanence in politics. A discriminating factor that sometimes dominates this access is gender, but not always, and not with the same linearity. As Chiara Saraceno writes, the traduction is mine, precisely because there is no country, even in the most rich and developed part of the world, in which women are treated equally to men, where they receive the same amount of resources, where their skills receive the same support to see things from their point of view, regarding what they can or cannot do, who they may or may not be, means to propose the most severe and rigorous testing both of theories and of practice. This focus on capabilities will thus allow organizations and public institutions to identify policies that can really guarantee that each person's capabilities are fully developed. It is therefore to be hoped that women provided with education and training to enter the labor market or political activities will not be overwhelmed by work and concerns in the home, for example. It is to be hoped that each resource is ensured to create opportunity and freedom so that every woman can have the power to manage her own life. What I would like to emphasize is how important the job of removing these obstacles is in order to prepare the conditions for such a power to be put in practice, and the role of women gradually gaining position of powers, along with the long-term vision of the leaders, be they men or women, are essential. The critical mass of women sitting at the table of decision makers has yet to come, and the conditions which can let this long-term vision grow have yet to enlarge. For this reason, we still need measures to rebalance this gap, such as gender quota laws. I think about them in the form of sunset laws, just to underline the fact that it cannot be our perspective. We must imagine the gender quota law as a medicine, as the pharmacon, the Platonian pharmacon, that is both a poison and the medicine. And we have to take it. We need it. And we need not only this kind of provisions, we need also to create more moments like this one, like this conference of the State of the Union, where we have the opportunity to consider and build a new way of thinking. Because I was thinking about that not even women are choosing women. We say, well, women have the 28% of the candidates, and they're about the 28% of the elected. Yes, but women are the 52% of the human beings. So not even this 52% choose his part, his counterpart. I think we have to work hard, and I'm really happy to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank all of my 4 panelists for such wonderful interventions. Lots of food for thought, for action, and also inspiration. But I do want to give you, the audience, a chance to engage with these wonderful women. So who wants to ask the first question? I know it's always tough to ask the first question, but who's going? Okay. If you could just simply say who you are.
Yes, I am Alessandra Minello. I work here as a researcher at the UI, and I work on a project about gender and education. First of all, thank you for your inspiring speeches. I have 2 questions, one for Professor Galligan and the other one for President Ghezzi. I must say they are very provocative. And the first one is, Professor Galligan, you saw that as what changed from 2001 to 2016, introducing the quotas. My question is, what would be your expectations? Whether, let's make an experiment and we take out quotas in 10 years, what would happen? Well, my expectation would be that the presence of women would drop to the level of 2001, or more or less at that level. As Cristina Giacchi told us, it's a medicine. Is it their perfect medicine? And the second, the question to Mrs. Ghezzi is about the participation of women on the labor market. In the Dutch system, they found this solution, which is the Dutch solution, that is basically the part-time, having high level of part-time workers. So women are much more involved in the labor market, but they are working as part-time workers. Again, is this really the solution? I mean, can we find, isn't it time now to find alternative medicines to increase equality and participation of women in politics and in the labor market?
Very much. I'm just going to ask, is there anyone else? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Giulia Bertezzola. I work for the European Commission in the banking sector, so a very male-dominated sector. I mean, with my question, I would like to go back to a topic which was tackled by Professor Galligan, but a bit also indirectly from in the other speeches, because we talk very much about the rights of women to reach the leadership position, but not so much, in my view, on about the image or what is expected by women leaders. I'm asking this question because, for example, as you probably know, the High Representative Mogherini was fairly criticized recently because she showed after the Brussels attack that she was touched. She was accused of being emotional, so I'm wondering if, in parallel to fighting for women rights to occupy leadership positions, we are also somehow fighting for women to be diverse, to be different, and if not, what do you think we should do to tackle also this issue? Because we are different.
It is a very important issue. Anyone else wants to ask a third question? Yes, please.
Planets. She taught Ada Lovelace, Lord Byron's daughter, mathematics, and Ada Lovelace then, with Charles Babbage, proceeded to work on the analytical machine. He was stumped. She suggested using Jacquard Loon cards with holes punched in them, and the IBM and the binomial theorem. I got told this story when I was 16 in Silicon Valley. And I think the sadness is that Mary Somerville's tomb is in Naples. She lived in Florence, but she went to Naples after her husband died. And the name is knocked off the tomb. It doesn't have her name. And I think we need to remember and to learn our contribution and teach it to others. When I ask this question in the cemetery, somebody might answer Turing of the Apple computer. But I say no, it's earlier and it's two women.
My name is Julia Race, and I'm director of the British Institute of Florence, and I haven't worn the political lion skin, but I have occupied leadership positions in Italy, in Brussels, in South Africa, and in Egypt, and some of my experiences might be, well, they surprised me in terms of the leadership role in those different countries. One of the things that I noticed, I think it was Professor Galligan talked about being interrupted, and there was a little buzz about being interrupted, and I started thinking about that because it's my experience that often if two women are talking, well, let's start it with two men are talking, they're having an important meeting. If two women are talking, they're probably gossiping or doing something fairly frivolous. And I remembered a book that I read some time ago, which I would really recommend to you, with a lot of conversational analysis in it. Deborah Tannen, Talking from 9 to 5, Who Says What and What Gets Done at Work. And there's a lot of very hard linguistic theory in it, but it comes up with a whole system about the credit that's given for ideas, for developing ideas, for building on ideas. And my question was actually related to something about giving feedback to people. It's quite difficult to give feedback to people about that kind of behavior. And I can't remember which company it is, but there's a company in the UK which has just started to do the reverse mentoring and sponsorship from what Presidente Ghezzi was talking about. You were talking about men mentoring women, I think. And what this company is doing is getting younger women to help maybe the more mature and perhaps potentially slightly unreconstructed males of the company to understand what impact their behavior can have. Every time I'm on a panel when I'm told, could you be a bit quick? Like my intervention is worth less than the males who've been given the longer slots before. So I just wanted to recommend that book and ask if there was any experience on the panel or anywhere else about this sort of reverse mentoring where, especially not just younger women, but also younger women are giving some of that feedback on that very subtle behavior which is difficult to challenge.
I'm going to go back to the panel and to all of the panel just for a final comment. Reverse order. So, Christina.
No, just a few words to say that I thought that quotas are medicine, but we don't need only one. When we have a bad fever, we need more than one medicine. So we need both. We need quotas in a sunset perspective for a few years, 10 years, 15 years, in order to give us a different horizon, and we need to work strongly on the way of thinking, because it's impossible to think that women are not choosing women. So we need both the medicine. We need the medicine of thought, of culture, and we need the medicine of quotas to realize the critical mass that is necessary to change the rules. If you never try to be the only woman at the table, you cannot understand in deep what it means, not to be able to change the rules, to be able only to play your role in the rules that someone else has written. So we need the critical mass, we need the quotas to have people around that table. Then we had to strongly work on the way of thinking, to have women with the right way of thinking at the table, sitting there, and to have women that, like Joya said, take the opportunity without thinking that is a privilege, that is that is an octroyer position. Because that was the main error our feminist heroines did in the past, I think. To think that, I don't know the English word, affamare il patriarcato, to starve patriarchate was the only way of fight, not to be there, to be absent. To be absent is to be absent. If you're not there, you're not there. You're not counting more.
Good. Let's see if I captured all the points. I'll start from part-time and the Dutch example. I don't know whether that is one of the tools that you consider, an alternative one to support women. I think I said I see 5 different types of initiatives that one can take, and one of them is absolutely around flexibility of work. And this brings actually a much wider topic. I think that, the office as we know it today is dead anyway. We are, going very, very fast towards a different world, a more robotized world, a world of drones, a world that is completely connected, where you can work from anywhere. We do work from anywhere already. So part-times and in general, more than part-time, different ways of working are absolutely part of the solution for both men and women. I think, and this will in turn support and help women balance better their lives and the burden of care. So I hope I have answered your question with that. What is expected of women leaders is a fantastic question also, which I think is linked to the unconscious biases. As soon as you were speaking of Mogherini crying, Silvia and I were discussing that literally 2 weeks before Mogherini cried, Obama cried. Obama cried in rage and frustration when giving his 100th speech on gun control, and yet more people unlawfully killed in the US. And that's exactly the point. The reaction to him crying and the reaction to her crying is a different reaction, even though they absolutely both had very good cause for crying. And that's exactly the point I was making when I was saying there is an alarm bell. It's much more subtle now. She is not up to her job because she cries. No one thought of that for a second of Obama. And that's what we need to correct, monitor for now, which brings me then to the mentoring and the feedback. I consider mentoring and feedback differently and fundamental, both of them fundamental. I spoke of more senior people mentoring and sponsoring, because when you are more senior, you have more power, so you can sponsor younger people to come up in the organization. And that's very important. I personally am mentored, for example, in Zurich, by younger colleagues on all things digital and technology, for example. So I believe in reverse mentoring. I also think that feedback should be a normal tool in any organization, should always be two-way, should always be a duty to give, a duty to accept, and open ears. I think any newly hired person should be able to say, you know, I was hurt when you did this or that. And that's how you made me feel, because as you all know, there is no arguing against how you make a person feel. You know, someone much more important than myself said one day, people will not remember what you did or what you said. They will remember what you made them feel.
Thank you. Yvonne?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very thoughtful questions that I think I would like to do my best to address. In terms of gender quotas and their absence, I agree. The hypothesis is if they go tomorrow or today, what will happen in 10 years' time? Nothing much will have changed, is my view, and I think that's true. On the other hand, they need to be given time to make changes, and over time, the implementation of that medicine can change mindsets and can make the participation of women in positions of power normal. And the normalizing of it is what we're about, is what the aim of quotas is, and the aim of all of that, of these measures. They cannot be measures that exist on their own. And exactly as you said, they need to be accompanied by many other supportive measures so that quotas themselves are not held responsible if they fail to deliver. And that's a big problem, an issue as well. I think, again, picking up on the point of a woman leader showing emotion in the face of a tragedy, I think we have to question what is the bias of the media here as much as anything else.
I would like to say the same thing.
Yeah.
I would like to say the same thing.
Yeah. And we agree the role of the media is so powerful in shaping how we perceive everything. And it's another example of the double standard to which women are held, a double standard that is constructed by a masculine norm and a culture which accepts masculine norms as being appropriately applied to females, but because they're masculine norms, men can break them, but women can't. So there are issues around that. The other point that I wanted to make is, again, around the issue of subtle bias replacing obvious discrimination. That is very, very true, I think. Many of the laws have removed the obvious discriminatory questions. We are often having to tackle the subtle biases that remain behind, that cannot be easily identified. But I really feel that we have a great strength in two generations of peoples. We have older feminists with the understanding of the second wave women's movement and the understanding of how all those laws were introduced and changed and hard fought for. And we have the millennial generation for whom equality and justice are very important issues. And together, I think the millennial generation and the older feminists, experienced rather than older, let's say more experienced people, can actually make a huge difference to how we construct the world going towards 2050.
Thank you.
Thank you. First, I would like to reply to the problem of quotas, because I know that the young people, normally young women, is normally are more perplexed, no? Or against the quota system. And now, I saw this because I also some of us started with some criticism on quotas, no? Because for us, as you said before, it would represent a sconfitta? Defeat, no? Because but for me, quotas can be, must consider as medicine, but it became a little poison, as you said before, and so I pretend, for me, it's very important that we respect some conditions. First of all, absolutely to combine quotas with other actions, positive actions. Second, transparent procedures for men and women in the decision about the selection. And we put this, I insist so much because in our report of Parliament for the board, quotas, etc., we insist on this. There is in the text that we ask to consider the perspective to increase the number of women as an occasion, an opportunity for sharing a new methods and procedures for everybody. No? Because we have to compare the CV of male and female. Also, if is underrepresented women, we can have this positive action more. But at the same, because just to say a little provocative thing, I want to avoid two risks. For women, that they have to be or Nobel Prize to be considered, or the friend of the boss. A second, for male, that they are in all boys networks and even not to show their capacity, their professionalism. Allora, if we consider this a way to reconsider the possibility for everybody to have this transparent procedure, that can be not a privilege or something or separate measures, but for a mainstreaming measure. Second thing, and I'm just here, I conclude, I'm very interested on the symbolic aspect that you consider, because as you said before, that some of you, we sometimes as women underestimate the role of media system. And it's strange, because normally we discuss about anything in any aspect, and not about what it means, this kind of betraying that it is made by media, that offer also to young people, boy as friend, an image, very, very, caricaturale, distortion of image of women, and not respecting the different and the richness of the identities of women. That's so real reaction. Maybe this can show this the same fear that you say before, no? The fear of diversity, the fear of women, but also inside the media is ensure more. No, some stereotype that the reality of maybe some more complex identities than the usual. And also is important thing that we, as women, recognize other women's values. Sometimes because till you are a little or symbolical presence, no, and not a critical mass. You know, is a human, that sometimes you know that or you or the other one. It's terrible, and sometimes it happens also in politics, but if we recognize the role and the capacity of the others is a very, very important way for a different kind of leadership, a different kind of empowerment. And when you say before, you have to recognize the name of some mothers that we had, if it's not we that do it, nobody others. And normally when I speak in a parliament on some directive or some laws, I normally recall the name of the woman, of the women that was the presented, signatures or the presented by these laws. Sometimes if you think about it, is normal that you say the law linked to a man name, but never with a female male, and so that we have to be more generous with other colleagues.
Thank you. Yes, generosity, sisterhood, support, and mentoring. We need it all. And I think this has been a wonderful discussion and debate. A lot has happened. It is a better world, not just for women, but for humankind. But there is still a lot left to do. And I think that this year, in autumn this year, we're going to see the most savage electoral contest in the history of democratic politics, where on the one hand we're likely to have someone who is neither trained to do the job, has no experience, and is a complete misogynist, versus a woman who has the experience, is probably the most prepared politician ever to be president of the largest, well, I was about to say the largest democracy in the world, that's not accurate, but a very important democracy in the world. I guarantee you it is going to be savage. It is going to be fierce and savage. And I have to say, I will cry if Donald Trump becomes president of the United States. And if I didn't have a job, I would actually go to the United States and knock on doors, because I think it will be a really awful election. But what we're facing is someone who is an open misogynist and has got away with it, versus the most prepared politician, man or woman, in the history of the United States. A lot rests on this election, but it's going to be very ugly. Can I really thank this wonderful band of women that we've had this morning?